Good morning. Thank you for joining us here midweek, and glad to have you here. And we'll continue today. If you want to grab a Bible and begin to find the 25th Psalm, we'll be continuing there, picking up in the sixth verse of the 25th Psalm. And we'll continue to look at David's words. Good words for us, good example for us, because David's words here are dealing with his guilt, the consequences, the problems that have arisen because of his sin. And so, slightly different, you could say, from some of the Psalms. Some of the Psalms that, when we look at them, they're dealing with problem, they're dealing with crisis, they're dealing with difficulty, but many times they are for no apparent reason, or sometimes those problems are coming up because of the psalmist's righteousness, because he's living, trying to live right, then the enemy is coming against him. This psalm is a little different and probably a little more, we can relate to it a little more, because this psalm deals particularly with the problems David is dealing with because of his own sin and the consequences that have come about because of that sin. And what we're seeing is how David, how he prayed when he found himself in this predicament as a result, again, of his sin. And so we're picking up in verse 6. And what David's going to begin to do here is he starts out by saying, remember, there in verse 6. And so he's calling on God to remember. And he's going to lay out some things. He's going to ask God to remember his own compassion and mercy. He's calling on God to remember that He is a merciful God, that He is a compassionate God. He says here, remember, O Lord, thy tender mercies and thy loving kindness, for they have been ever of old. And so David is remembering, or asking God to remember his own mercy. And we may, as we talked about the other day, we can be granted forgiveness for our sin. But that doesn't mean we don't reap the harvest, that we don't still have consequences of that sin. For example, I think of a very, very extreme case from way back in my past. A young man that I went to school with, that went to high school with, attempted to take his own life. And he was unsuccessful, thankfully. Unfortunately, he will be paralyzed for the rest of his life. And so while he can pray and ask God for forgiveness for the act, he still has the consequences. Now, that is a very extreme example. But David, for example, committed adultery with Bathsheba. God can forgive him for that sin, but the consequences of that sin are going to play out for many years to come. And so David recognizes that, and that, again, even after we have repented of our sin, been forgiven of our sin, we still can face the consequence. And that's where David is here. He's facing the consequences of a sin that was committed many years ago, of a sin that he had been forgiven for, that he had confessed, but he is now in a crisis, facing a difficult time in his life as a result of it. And so he's going to call on God here. We're going to see three remembers. He calls on God in this passage. First of all, he asks God to remember his mercy. Remember, O Lord, thy tender mercies. And so David calls on again Jehovah here, all capitals, the word Lord in all capital letters, a God, a covenant-keeping God is what that name represents. And so he calls on this covenant-keeping God to remember his mercy or compassion or pity are some of the ways that that word can be translated. And so David calls on God again, and the word remember may be a little bit misleading to us, because again, when we hear the word remember, it assumes it has been forgotten. A good way, I think, for us, as the way we would talk today, would be that David appealed to God's mercy, as we see on television shows sometimes, where somebody throws themselves on the mercy of the court. David is throwing himself on the mercy of God, and so David is calling on that. He's calling on his mercy and his loving kindness. For they have been ever of old. David says they have always been your characteristic. They have always been your traits. When I have been in trouble before, it was your mercy and your loving kindness that has rescued me. And so I'm calling on that same mercy and loving kindness. Another way I think of that maybe help clear up, kind of put this in language that maybe would work a little better for us today, is to read it as David is saying, I remember your mercy and your loving kindness. And so David is saying, I remember it. I know you have it, and so I'm asking for it. And so David teaches us that when we find ourselves in crisis, when we find ourselves in troublesome times, that we call on the mercy, the tender mercy, and the loving kindness of God, because they have always been his characteristics. They have always been his the mark of who he is, and that's our hope. David's only hope is in the mercy and loving kindness of God, and the same is true of us. Our only hope is in that mercy and loving kindness that God has. And then David lays it out here in verse 7 when he says, remember not the sins of my youth, nor my transgressions, according to thy mercy. Hear that mercy again. Remember thou me for thy goodness sake, O Lord. And there's that capital again, that all capitals, Jehovah. And so David is in a situation where he is continuing to reap what he has sown. He is continuing to have to pay the price for the sin. We've probably all been there before, like David. We think it's done, we think it's gone, we think it's forgotten, and boom, up it comes and sticks up its ugly head. Again, perhaps the case here is we don't know what was going on, what the problem was. Maybe it was Absalom again, the rebellion of Absalom as he sought to overthrow David from the throne. And so David is now suffering the consequences of his sin. And so David is asking God basically for crop failure. David has sown his wild oats, and now he's asking God. He's pleading with God to forget these old sins. The first, he says, remember it not, forget it. And so what David is saying, he's asking God not to hold those sins against him anymore. He's asking God not to do that. And he calls them here in verse 7 not only sins, but transgressions. And the interesting thing about that word transgression is that word means a willful disobedience, a choice that David made, and so he's acknowledging that, and so he's asking God, he's pleading with God to not hold that sin, that rebellion in his life, that he had rebelled against the authority of God, and he's asking God not to remember that. According to thy mercy, remember thou me for thy goodness' sake, O Lord. And so his third remember here in this verse is he's don't remember my sin, my transgression. Remember not my transgressions and my sin, but according to thy mercy, remember me for goodness' sake. And so he's asking God, he's pleading with God on the basis of God's goodness and His nature, that God would have mercy on him and forgive him. What these couple of verses, I think, can serve to remind us of is really the danger, the consequence of sin. Sin is something that, as David is learning here, it's not something that goes away quickly. We may commit, what seems like to us maybe an insignificant sin today, and then we'd have to deal with the consequences of that sin even for years to come. David is an example. Again, the young man I talked about, we make a decision and then we suffer because of that for many years through our life, and that sin just wreaks havoc in our life. And so a couple of lessons we learn from that is it reminds us then to be careful of sin. That no matter how good it looks, no matter how we think we've got it figured out, but the consequences we cannot, we can never be deceived, tricked by sin, by that temporary pleasure. There are many people in this world, for example, especially this is, and many of you that are listening will it may through personal experience you've seen this one. There are so many people around us who are suffering today consequences because of just one experiment with drugs. That it was their first experiment, it was their only experiment, it went wrong, and they will physically and or mentally suffer for that decision for years to come. I go way back in time. If you kept up with sports, there was a young man who played at the University of Maryland named Len Bias, an amazing basketball player who had signed a professional basketball contract, probably going to be a multi-millionaire before he's 21, 22 years old, to play professional basketball, found dead, and from all accounts, it was his first and only uh, experiment or try of drugs, and because of that, if I remember correctly, the details, he had some heart problems maybe he didn't know about, and those drugs, I may be wrong about that, but whatever it was, that one and only thing took his life. And so, for a few moments of pleasure, we see in David's example, and all of us could name more examples, that sin, it has, all we tend to do is look at right here, the pleasure, the fun that's in front of us. What we have to learn to do is when sin begins to tempt us, and sin begins to creep into the picture, is to remember the long term consequences. I expect if we went back and asked Adam and Eve about the long-term consequences of sin, that they could tell us a story or two. And so we have to be careful. I think we can take from this passage, one of the things we learn is, again, to be very careful with sin, that it can certainly have long-reaching consequences. And then second is, then when it does have, what we do after the fact is David now is going to call out and cry to God to forgive him, and to help him deal with the consequences of that sin. And so these few verses are, again, I think, just a very clear reminder for us of the danger and the consequences of sin, to remind us that to always to keep our eyes on the Lord, to follow His Word, because the consequences can be severe and can be lifelong. All right, we'll wrap up here. I hope that helps you. I hope that gives you some ammunition to keep Satan at bay. He'll certainly find a way to tempt us and to put things in front of us, because he recognizes the long-term consequences of sin. We should too. All right, you have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow morning.